So, yeah, sorry to the slow start. That just always seems to happen with any online presentation. So, today, yeah, I'm here to talk about eel, Anguilla. This is the freshwater eel, European eel, and I'm going to cover everything from sort of a basic overview of their life cycle to some of the interesting points and things that have interested me and kept me interested in this wonderful species, and then go on to some of the threats and some of our solutions to the threats as well, and then pick out a few little specific areas within that which are, I guess, either pertinent to some of the work that's going on with the trust or are just particularly interesting for eel in general. So, Ross, if you jump forward one slide. Great. I completely forgot I didn't have control of it then. So, yeah, all fish are wonderful, but eel are special. So, what I mean by this is that fish in general often get overlooked and are sometimes hard to engage with. And it's one of those interesting worlds that we have to sort of delve into, where we are completely separate from the world that they live in, and they are separate from our world. And there's, because of this separation, sometimes they get overlooked, and sometimes we miss how wonderful these species are. But within this wonderful world of fish, we have this particularly special character, which is the eel. And Ross, if you want to jump forward one more. So, I guess a good place to always start with the eel is its life cycle, because it's particularly complex, it's particularly difficult just to manage this species, preserve this species, and conserve this species because of its life cycle and how intricate and how far-ranging it is because of this. So to give a quick overview, this life cycle here, we'll start at the top, the egg. This is floating in a sort of planktonic soup in the Sargasso Sea, and this hatches out very, very quickly. It's usually within a few days these eggs have hatched, and you get this pre-larval stage just as it emerges, tiny little thing. And as it's floating in this planktonic soup, this mix of phytoplankton, zooplankton, every wonderful and odd creature within the sea, it's drifting on currents, and these currents start to direct it towards the continental shelf of Europe. And over this period, it starts to form this elongated willow leaf shaped shape. It's completely translucent, and it's sort of this bottom right hand one that you can see. So quite a long thing, complete translucent, and this ribbon shape to it helps it catch oceanic currents and carries it on its way. Over this time, which is a substantial amount of time, anything from sort of around about a year to 2 years, dependent on oceanic currents, dependent on storms, dependent on a lot of different factors. This migration, or this movement towards the continental shelf of Europe, is using the Gulf Stream and other oceanic currents, but there is definitely an active element of swimming as well. So these eels swim with the current, and we know this because the rate in which they get from the Sargasso Sea to the continental shelf wouldn't be possible if they didn't actively swim as well. So when it arrives at our coastline, it's somewhat changed from this willow leaf shape, this ribbon shape, and it's compressed, and it is now still translucent, but a lot more eel shaped. It's cylindrical body. This bottom middle one here is around about what you'd expect an eel to look like, but it's completely pigmentless. There's no coloration to it. It waits within this area on sort of the heads of tides and in estuary areas along the coastlines. It waits here for months sometimes. And what it's waiting for is an increase in temperature. And, sorry, I think some of them are timers, so they will jump forward sometimes. If you can jump back just what, yeah, nice one, thanks. So yeah, it'll wait in this area for months sometimes, and it's waiting for the fresh water to start to warm up around about 10 degrees, and it'll start to move into fresh water. And as it does this, it's ebbing and flowing with the tide and moving in and out and testing the water temperature to get a sort of feel for when it's ready. And at this temperature, it's 10 degrees or aroundabouts, moves into our freshwater habitats. Some do stay on the coast, but most of them, or what we think is most of them, go into freshwater. And this time it starts to gain pigmentation, and it's known as an elver, so this sort of bottom left. And this is a perfect eel. It's perfect miniature eel. We see a lot of these moving in along the banks of our rivers, and this you'd see, or you would see if you're very lucky, as like a mass migration inwards into our freshwater zones. And as it moves into freshwater, it tries to establish territories and regions and habitats that it has a preference to. And within this time, it's known as a yellow eel. And this yellow eel phase is the longest life stage of the eel. This can be decades long, but usually it's around about 7 years for a male to 14 for a female. And this is within our area of Europe. So within the UK, that's sort of what we'd look at for your average age for an eel. Depending on where you are in Europe, it can change hugely. So if you're in warm regions, if you're in the Mediterranean, eels will mature or eels will grow very, very quickly, 2, 3, 4 years, and be able to move back out again very much quicker than they do in our colder waters. So the eel stays in this life stage for a long time and grows and grows. And once it attains the resources it needs to make that entire journey in reverse. So this around 4,000-mile journey back to the Sargasso Sea. And over this period in its life, it's known as the silver eel. It starts to change in form and shape. Its internal organs shut down, or its internal sort of its gastrointestinal tract shuts down because it doesn't feed in this life stage. It's gained all of the mass and the fat and the resources it needs, and it starts to put all of its resources into reproduction. And over this time, the goal is to migrate and to spawn. So as it migrates and moves out of freshwater into a marine environment on its journey to the Sargasso Sea, these features of the silver eel become more pronounced, and the development goes less from an investment into muscle and migratory sort of vigor all the way to just reproduction. And once they arrive at the Sargasso Sea, they are pretty much just bloated with eggs or ready to mate as males. And that's what they are. They're just sacs carrying sperm and eggs, and that is their sole function then. And once they make it back to the Sargasso Sea, back to this region where they were born, they spawn and then they die. And the whole cycle starts again. And just through this, you can see how complex this animal is. Ross, if you want to go to the next slide, I've got some sort of examples that people can see. So this is your glass eel. Very, very little pigmentation on this one. You can just see the vertebrae going through, and you can see this lump on its head. That's the brain mass, this neuromass, and you can see two black eyes as well. These are pretty much the features that you can that you can see in an early stage glass eel. Someone just mentioned then, where is the Sargasso Sea? I think that was the question. So pretty much cut out right or east from Florida into that region there. It's a huge body of water, thousands of miles in circumference and area. It's exceedingly deep in certain regions. It's covered in a mass of sargassum weed, which is a floating mat of a particular marine species of weed, and also there's the name Sargasso comes from the sargassum weed, which is prevalent and creates this surface mat there. And one more point I think to make on the glass eel is that's how much it weighs, 0.42 grams. And this thing is potentially 2 years old, and it's already traveled 4,000 miles in its life. And it's this tiny, tiny dot of a creature, which is incredible. Ross, you want to jump one more? This is the elder stage, so you can see its mass has got bigger. This is 0.57. It's still not a huge creature. It's, as I was saying before, a perfect miniature eel. And this has gained full pigmentation, and at this stage is moving into freshwater zones and seeking habitat and finding refuge so that it can start to gain resources, and it'll start to bulk up hugely on from this point on. An interesting point with the elders is that they're actually usually smaller in length than the glass eels, because they go through this sort of period of shrinkage where the length sort of reduces, but they just start to thicken. They start to become more robust and look like a little eel. Whereas, yeah, your typical glass eel looks extremely flimsy. They're very, very thin, look like you could just snap them. They're just like a strand of hair, but they're a little bit longer than glass eels. So sometimes these are a little bit small, even by up to a centimetre with this shrinkage. Ross, one more, please. Your yellow eel. This is usually the stage that people bump into these things, and it's less because they're really obvious to find, and more just the fact that they're a very long-lived species. Like I said, these can be decades old. So this species is knocking around in all sorts of waterways, everything from canals to fast-flowing headwaters. These things, the reason why they've survived them, the reason why they are still quite abundant, even though we'll sort of touch on this later on, is that they are survivors. They can live in a sewage-filled ditch that is polluted consistently. They can live in areas where heavy metals and historic pollution from maybe mining or industry or historic pollutants from a particularly sort of negative industry that was there in the past and in the substrate and soaked into it and ingrained within this body of water. They're still there, they're still prevalent, and the only issue is we don't fully understand the complications and implications of fully, of non-metabolizing compounds that sit within these eels as they grow. So there's positives and negatives of being able to survive and be a survivor, I guess, but we don't fully understand how that impacts the species as a whole. Another one, Ross? So I think it was probably easier to show you a comparison here rather than putting up a picture of a yellow eel than a picture of a silver eel, because some of them are quite subtle differences, others are quite extreme. So this top bit here, this top picture, you can sort of see a yellow eel on top, silver eel on the bottom. A little bit of change in coloration here, and this silver eel is still, it's really only just starting to silver properly. And it'll get the features will become more pronounced and the features will become more extreme as it goes through this process, and as it also continues with its migration to the Sargasso Sea. So the main features here, which is probably easier to see on the bottom left picture, is this extremely enlarged eye. And you can see the difference between the top and the bottom eel here. That eye is enlarged so much, and this isn't even the full extreme. But what we do think this is down to is that a lot of seaward migrating species have large eyes, and for a long time it was thought that it was based on getting the most possible light into your eye and using this essentially just to be able to absorb more light. But what some of the thinking is now is that the magnetocytes, or the sites, the receptors to allow animals to locate themselves off the Earth's magnetic pull, that feature is found in the eye of the eel, which is pretty cool. And we think that this enlarged eye means that these magnetocytes will be either more pronounced or they will have a greater function. Yet a lot of this is still not fully understood. Other features to sort of note on here is the shape of the pectoral fin changes, the shape of the end of the fin, the caudal. So if you go back up to the top picture, you can see this like big paddle like tail on the bottom, and the top one is much more curved and rounded. And all of these are just promoting a long seaward migration. And this eel doesn't look much bigger in size at all. You know, in anything, it's slightly smaller due to that tail shrinkage. But this is a male silver eel, and they mature a lot smaller size, and they go out to sea, and anything sort of around about the 30 centimeter mark would be pretty average for a male eel. If you're looking at a female, you'd be looking way towards the sort of 60, 70 centimeter mark. And there was one other cool thing which I can never help myself from putting on the slide. This bottom right picture. So that neither of these are silver eels, these are yellow eels, but this was just to show some of the changes, adaptations, and the I guess just the differences within a population of the same life stage. So this top eel is a narrowhead eel, that's what we would refer to it as, and the bottom one is a broadhead eel. And you can see this muscle mass behind the eye of the bottom one, this huge enlarged muscle mass. And this is because both of them have different feeding strategies. The top one is feeding on invertebrates, small, soft creatures, and the bottom one is eating mollusks, much harder, much denser materials that really require a greater jaw strength to be able to actually exploit this. Really interesting thing is that this is the same species in the same life stage, and they are exploiting two different food groups, which allows them to live in much greater densities, which I find it absolutely amazing. They have chosen, or they haven't chosen at all, but there's a difference here which has allowed them to exploit different niches so that they don't compete with each other. And I find that is absolutely fascinating. You know, you don't get this in many species that live in such close proximity to each other. And again, we're not too sure what would control this, if there's a gene in there, if it's through pressures in early life, which has driven them to develop greater muscle mass. But the shape of the skull, not only the muscle mass is different in these eels, and it's quite incredible, really. And due to the fact that the population is all one mixed genetic soup, that it's quite difficult to pick up any trends, and there aren't any trends, you know, with genetically distinct populations, because it's all one genetic stock. So just a really, really cool thing. And I love to show that between life stages there's a difference, but within life stages there's so much difference, and there is so much diversity within a population. Next slide, please. So this is the one where I really get a proper rant on, and I delve into some of the cool and weird and wonderful things of the eel. And I guess this slide itself came from the fact that everyone always says, "Oh, why eel?" Whenever I say that, that's what I study, that's what I work with, or that's my sort of favorite animal. And you know, there's so much. And this slide, you know, where do you start? If we go back into sort of the history of the eel, there's remains found of eel carcasses, eel bones within camps of early human life, the sort of hunter-gatherer style, this movement of humans with the migration of animals, and using resources which are available at different times of the year. They found that eel is quite prevalent in certain areas, where these nomadic groups moved around, and they think that maybe it could be this either inward migration or outward migration that they knew about, and they could rely on this quite heavily. Large influxes of very, very small eels in great numbers, and then at a different time in the year, which would fall in winter, a large outward migration of silver eels, much, much larger. And if you think of these enormous amounts of food passing you by in such great numbers, if you're able to harvest these, then that's a incredible resource to have. So it's very much tied to early human, I guess, settlements and movements. This migration, And it's not just humans, obviously. These migrations have changed the inward and outward migration of eel have changed the migration of other species. So we have migratory birds and waders and everything from kingfishers to osprey that would feed on eel in varying different life stages. And the eel has also been found in everything from sperm whales all the way through to, yeah, like I said, the tiniest little kingfisher on your local river. And it's incredible the amount of animals which maybe don't solely rely on the eel, but at some point in their life, the migration of these eels, or even just eel that live within their rivers for these long periods of time, are very much important to them. They're extremely good for putting weight on or for gaining sort of fat as well. They're extremely nutritious and their fat is quite unique as well. They are quite a fatty fish and it's stored in a very different way to many fish. So this is something that you'll see otters, do favor eels. And if you can get them, eels are very much a delicacy even within the animal world. Um, so going into, I guess, the science side of it, some of the things that interested me and some of the stuff that I'm researching, there's so much we don't know, and we just don't understand the controlling factors. I've touched on a few things that we just don't know, but I guess it is really quite a unique species that the more we find out, we have so many more questions, and even the fundamentals we do not fully understand yet. We know that they go to the Sargasso Sea to spawn, but we haven't ever witnessed it. We found, very, very young post-larval stages, freshly hatched out of the egg, that we can age quite reliably and say it's from here in this immediate area. And also, very recently, you may have seen that there was a publication tracking eels for the first time ever using the satellite tags, the pop-up satellite tags, which detach over off the eel after a certain amount of days. And they tracked the first ones ever to the Sargasso Sea to prove that that's actually where they are going. But other than that, there's still this huge void that we don't know about the spawning. What exactly happens there? What exactly is the region? What are the environmental conditions? And an interesting thing is we haven't been able to reliably reproduce eel in captivity. So this has been the billions of pounds have been spent on this research trying to crack this endeavor, but it still hasn't been done, and it's been done in terms of they've been able to get them to reproduce, but the young have always been either had some level of deformity or not survived all the way through, or there is issues with them which are make them essentially unsaleable if they were to be used as like a commercial product. So there's still so much we don't understand, and the majority of that comes down to what they're feeding on, and we just don't know what that is in these early life stages. I guess a really cool thing about the eel is that they transfer nutrients as well, all the way from the sea into our headwaters or into our high areas and high reaches of our rivers. So a lot of people will know this from salmon migrations that when salmon, especially the Pacific salmons, which die much more readily and frequently after spawning, unlike the Atlantic salmon, they deposit huge amounts of nutrients into headwaters and into higher reaches of rivers, which then enables and stimulates growth within that river, but also within the riparian zone, the green zone, which is growing along our rivers. And this is exceedingly important to stop these areas becoming nutrient poor. And if they become nutrient poor, then that starts to make a huge cascade of issues all the way through the ecological chain, starting with the invertebrates feeding on detritus, which just isn't there. So eels help with this, and allowing them to move through systems and allowing them to reach these headwaters and upper reaches will mean that they will take and deposit nutrients through just naturally growing and defecating, but also a portion of them will die, or a portion of them will feed other predators within that area, and the transfer of nutrients is continuing. Other cool random facts, eels were used as currency for a very long time. Areas like Ely, which has the cathedral, Ely Cathedral, the stone for Ely Cathedral was paid for in Eel. That area and many areas around England and a lot of the sort of south and the east coast and parts of the southwest had eels as currency, which would usually be used as a form of payment for rent or for payment of land that a lot of the farmers were using. And it's so much entrenched and ingrained within our society and history, within things that we depend on and things that we rely on, that it's often overlooked, but it's always there. It's always in the background, the eel, and it touches on so many aspects, and it's always interested people. With for thousands of years, people have been interested in eel. Everything from Aristotle, Sigmund Freud, Pliny the Elder. There's been people throughout history who've tried to tackle some of the knowledge gaps within the eel because they are so interesting. They, for a long time, thought that horse hairs from the hair of a horse's tail would fall out, and that would be the start of an eel. They thought also in different areas that beetles would I think it was that actually either beetles when they mated they produced eels or something to do with an eel. The dew in the morning, that was thought to be where eels were first created, and the dew on the grass would fall into small eels. And this was thought because eels have this wonderful ability to travel over land. And people would come out, and when the elvers and small eels were migrating into our rivers, a lot of them would come out of the water and try and get over barriers or go over grassy verges when it was wet. And people thought that in the morning, the dew of the grass had turned into eels. And I think what I'm trying to get through on this slide is that there's just so much of any aspect of the eel, whether it's looking into our history or delving into science or our economy or the ecosystem services it provides us. I think that is what I'm trying to portray with the eel. It's impossible to know it all. It's impossible to explain it all. It certainly is impossible to wrap it all up in a presentation, but just touching on some of the aspects which make this creature absolutely incredible, I think is its charm. And a lot of people, would probably not associate eel with charm, it being a sort of snake-like, slippery creature that comes out of the water onto land. But once you start to learn these aspects of it, I think it starts to become really special. Right, Ross, after that massive rant, we can go on to the next one. So, after hearing all that wonderful stuff about eel, I'll tell you about their decline. And the decline of the eel, really, what we're talking about here is we want to get back to levels or to a population size which was pre-1980s. We talk about the 1980s as like this golden era when eel were super abundant, but really what this is, it's just a shift in baseline that we're talking about. In the pre-1980s, so 70s through to 80s, there was a great number of eels and the stock was incredibly high and inward migration was enormous. We're talking billions and billions of eel every year arriving at our coastline, and obviously a good proportion of those do survive and then go on to spawn, and this perpetuates it. Before the 70s, 80s, the eel population must have been higher. It's just that's really when we started to record most of our fishing data, and we started to get an idea of what the population was. So the decline after the mid 1980s, there was an absolutely catastrophic loss. And we're talking about a loss of 95 to 99% in areas of Europe. This changes depending on where you are in Europe, but all of them were 90% plus, which is absolutely astonishing over this very, very small period of time. And classic eel, we don't really know what was this cause of some sort of catastrophe which plummeted populations to this state. But I think the most important aspect of this slide and this information isn't the fact that there was a monumental crash in the population. It is the fact that the eel has never bounced back to these pre-1980s levels. It's never even come close. And that's because we've degraded our natural ecosystems and access to habitats which were favorable by eel. We've fragmented these, we've separated these, we've removed these, we've degraded them, we've polluted them further. And there's a whole myriad of different issues which are facing the eel now and stopping it from getting back to where it needs to be, which is these extremely abundant levels. And this is the key point within this, really, is the fact that eels have not been able to come back to their former glory because we have such a degraded and fragmented freshwater habitat. And this isn't just across the UK, even though the UK is atrocious. This is across all of Europe. We talk, very heavily about river barriers being a real problem for salmon and for fish in general. And it's exactly the same for eel. Even though these creatures can climb out of water, it's our only climbing fish species, unlike areas like New Zealand, where you've got like your galaxid species and multiple species of eel. We only have this one true climber. The lamprey uses sometimes like a jet propulsion and then sucks onto a smooth edge, but it doesn't climb. And this species, if they can't make it above barriers, then it is a real issue for a lot of fish species. So this is to the take home message from this, not the fact that we don't fully understand this massive monumental crash in the population, more the fact that it's never recovered, and we understand that to a greater degree. Next slide. So I touched on some of the threats there and went on my rant about river barriers. Top of the list, always will be with me. I hate river barriers. They're awful things and they're so unnecessary. And we can control things in a much better way than this now. This is not how we should be working. We should never be concreting the channels of our rivers and then putting big structures in to hold water back. We should be managing and working with nature to slow the flow down and to reconnect and I guess rewild sections to allow for flood mitigation in different areas using much more natural methods. Well, anyway, there's river barriers out there. Habitat loss, another huge one. I said before, eels are extremely versatile, wonderful creatures, able to survive pretty crazy things, really. But I mean, if they haven't got the habitat there, then there's only so much they can survive. There's only so much area they can exploit. There's only so many that can live together, even with the ability to exploit different food sources and be very flexible within their strategies of survival. There's still a limit if the habitat just simply isn't there. Pollution, I touched on that before again. The fact that eels can live in atrocious water quality doesn't mean that they should. We should be doing everything we can to improve water quality. And there are certain compounds that we do know that impact the migration of eel. And we know that it impacts the migration of eel because we know it impedes their swimming ability. So if an eel can't swim as fast or as far or for as long, then this is going to be serious in terms of its implications on a 4,000-mile migration. So there are certain chemicals that do have profound effects on them. And this is a particularly tolerant species. So, we should really be looking to improve this for the ecosystem, not just a single species like the eel. So fishing pressures. This is a really interesting one. So in Scotland, you can't fish for eel. It's illegal to recreationally fish for eel, and you also can't commercially fish for eel because as part of our eel management plan, we banned all fisheries and exploitation. So we would be able to say that anthropogenic pressures were low because we weren't exploiting it as a commercial entity or commercial product. So that's the state in Scotland, but it isn't the case in England. And there's still a large fishery in Northern Ireland, Lough Neagh, the Lough Neagh Fishermen's Cooperative Society. and they have a very well managed fishery, which is it's a substantial eel fishery, exploiting both yellow eel and silver eel phases, and they manage their fishery and have conservation initiatives to go with this. That isn't the case, or can't always be the case, in certain areas, so fisheries do not exist. So Loughney Fishermen's Cooperative Society is the only one that is currently operating in the UK for those life stages. And then with Brexit changing a lot of the trade agreements and trade routes, a lot of that impacted eel fisheries, which were in the south of south of England, and that closed down a lot of the fisheries there. So there isn't much fishery action within the UK really, apart from those small places. But across Europe, it's very much seen as a very desirable product. Everything from glass eel all the way to silver eel is eaten and commercially sold. But within Europe, you can't trade externally. So you can have a trade within Europe, but you can't sell outside of it. And this is part of the eel regulation. And from this, or what has come from this, is an illegal trade, an illegal smuggling trade, which is, on par with some of the big narcotics gangs. And you'll probably have seen recently, over the past good few years, actually, there's pretty regular smuggling gangs that have been thwarted by the police and arrested, and they've seized so many kilograms of glass eels. And when you see a glass eel as it's less than a gram, these are substantial numbers of glass eels. And this trade is stimulated by Asia and a market to buy eel and young eel and grow them on in Asia, and then they are then sold for consumption when they've fattened them up and when they've grown them on. But yeah, as the European eel is protected, it's critically endangered. It's a CITES Appendix 2 listed species. You can't trade it outside of Europe. And yes, this is where this huge illegal trade has come from. Invasive species, a problem across the board, really. A lot of these problems are across the board, really, but invasive species are an issue. This actually came from the fishery. So the one in particular I'm speaking about, Anguilla coracis, which is a nematode which lives within the swim bladder of the eel, and it impacts its ability to regulate. Well, the swim bladder regulates how an eel can move up and down in a water column. It controls its buoyancy. There's loads of other cool things that this swim bladder does, but in general, that's what you need to know. And if you can't control your buoyancy accurately and move gases between sort of within your body cavity, then it's a big issue, especially when you're trying to migrate over large distances. So this particular parasite has been a real issue, and within swim tests and swim tunnel tests, we do know that eels with a heavy infestation of this parasite, their swimming ability is impeded again. And I sort of link this with the fishery, because this was a shipment which came over. I can't remember where it came over from initially, but I think it was either they shipped European eel out to somewhere in Asia, and then they bought them back as adult eels and brought them back into Europe, and they were then infested with this parasite. And that's then spread across nearly the entire range of the European eel, which is pretty incredible, to be honest. And it is in the Essex, it's across Scotland, it's all through Europe. It's pretty bad, and infestations can be extremely heavy. That poorly understood in especially in Scotland. That's really focusing on eel and saying that we don't know enough in Scotland about our eel, and that's because a lot of the thoughts around eel in Scotland was that there wasn't many. Historically, there was this big survey that was carried out to see if a fishery could be established in Scotland, and it was found that it's not really going to be that commercially viable, so we're not going to focus on it. And since that point, there's been a bit of a loss of interest in certain areas, but there has been fisheries in Scotland, and from that we do gain some really cool information. So Loch Leven was a fishery at one point, a silver eel fishery, and they would set up nets on the exit of the loch, going into the River Leven, and catch silver eels there. And it's incredible looking at these old logs and seeing the numbers of silver eels and how they transported them on a horse and cart. And it is incredible to look at some of these fisheries which did exist. But in general, they are very poorly understood across Scotland. We don't really know key areas for their inward migration, where the best spots are to find good eel habitat or good eel populations, and where to protect and where to preserve. So this can be an issue when we're trying to conserve the species. Next slide, please. So, on a happier note, some of the answers. And I guess a lot of the answers are to some of the issues that were presented on the other side. So barrier removal, when and if we can get river barriers out, we 100% should. We always should be aiming for this. That is always the go-to, is removal. And then second to that is barrier passage solutions. So these come in all shapes and sizes, and I think maybe even the next slide is an example of that. But there's so many different methods that you can use to alleviate these barriers. And fish passes is like a general term, but I think there's a whole vast variety of fish passes. There's all sorts of like partial removals of river barriers, and the methods that you can use to get fish from point A to point B, which is below a barrier, to above it, are somewhat endless. And there's so many different innovations which are coming about now. But one thing, I guess, to take into consideration is that, especially within Scotland, this is a very salmon centric and salmon focused country, and that's because the salmon is tied very closely to the culture of the country, and it's associated with a lot of Scotland. And when people think of it, they think of salmon, but that is a really bad way to conserve salmon. If you're thinking purely about the salmon and trying to conserve it, you're already at a loss. This has got to be a holistic approach so that everything is protected as an ecosystem. And this is why barrier removal is so much better than passage solutions, because passage solutions look at a percentage of a, a particular species, and then it looks at a percentage of those being able to make it through this passage solution, this whatever it is, a Lorinier or a Alaskan fish pass or a rock ramp. A lot of them do look at just getting a certain percentage of specific fish through, and a lot of the focus is salmon. And if a salmon can get from below that barrier to above it, then job done. It is a fish pass because a fish has passed. In all technicality, they're correct. Yeah, they can get the sign off. But yeah, the issue is that if you only get one species through there, you're going to have so little diversity above these barriers that a lot of the diversity and interdependency within ecosystems isn't achieved. And the habitat stays poor, the populations stay low, and all of these interactions, positive interactions throughout life stages of different species, aren't fulfilled. So when barrier passage solutions are put in place, like a fish pass, it has to be for all fish. And probably the rock ramp is probably the best way you could go with a fish pass, because all you're trying to do is mimic diverse flow patterns and a really light incline. So it's achievable for all fish then. So yeah, better understanding and better use of freshwater, the way we use freshwater, the way we exploit it, we can work in harmony to a lot better degree with the freshwater world. We have huge abstractions, and in a country like Scotland, you have a lot of water, you have a lot of industries which depend on this. You've got everything from small scale distilleries to large hydro. You've got all sorts within the freshwater bodies, and we exploit them in very different ways. But there should always be an emphasis on creating some sort of harmony between these exploitations and the natural environment and the animals and organisms using that body of water. So restoration and rewilding, the Forth Rivers Trust is just a wonderful example of everything great about restoration and rewilding, and also barrier removal and passage solutions, to be fair. But this is a really interesting one. And when I talk about rewilding, there's so much you can do within a freshwater environment, but also there's so much you can do outside of the freshwater environment, which has a positive influence on it. So in this bottom right picture is a perfect example. And this, I believe, is the River Allen project that was, I think this was a good few years back now that these trees were planted. But this is just replanting a riparian zone. And it's simply adding trees to the bankside of a river, which is bare. And you don't only get this incredible influx of nutrient then of the leaves falling off and breaking down within the water, which is sort of what I was talking about before, introducing nutrients in there to ensure that this doesn't become nutrient poor. But you've also got, over time, shade will increase. And in an ever heating and warming world, we need areas of shade, especially to cover our rivers, our water. It slows down evaporation, but it also keeps temperatures down in the water. And when we look at species, salmonids in particular, they're extremely sensitive to temperature, water temperatures for their spawning habits. And if temperatures are too high, then the eggs simply won't hatch. There's certain things within trout eggs, I'm not sure if it's the same with salmon, but that proteins won't develop at certain temperatures. So this there's a certain mechanism which is triggered, which starts to thin the membrane of the egg, which allows the fish to first emerge and break through this membrane. And if that isn't triggered through the fact that the water temperature is slightly too high, then that membrane will never start to break down, and the fish won't ever be able to escape that first very, very essential stage of its life. And this is just one tiny, tiny example. So restoration and rewilding can have profound effects on our rivers, even if you're not ever putting your welly into the water. The last few points I'll touch on, new monitoring methods are coming about every single day, and it's incredible what we can do now, what we couldn't do when I started my career in freshwater, which was only 7-8 years back now, and it is incredible what we can do. I'm going to touch on eDNA methods in another slide, but the fact that we've got some of these tools now is a huge feather to our cap. And then lastly is improving our EMP, our eel management plan. So there's a Scottish eel management plan for each river basin district. There should be one eel management plan which targets specific efforts to alleviate pressures on eel and to help restore them to healthy pre-anthropogenic influence numbers, essentially. So our pre-1980s numbers is what we're looking for. We're trying to get those numbers back up. A lot of the eel management plans are lacking in ambition and in the actions that are taken, and these can be improved. Everything can be improved, and we should always be striving for this. And the eel management plan, because we've got something specific that targets eel and their conservation and their management, we should be constantly trying to improve and better this. Next slide, please. So here's just a really cool example. That is my arm with the fish on it. And this is a course that I teach semi-regularly. I'll probably do a few a year. And it's eel ropes. And it's a traditional method of barrier easement. Really cheap, really easy, very, very quick. And all you're doing is you're creating a rope out of straw. And this is like a straw hay mix that I've got here. And you're draping this rope over the front of a barrier. It only works on relatively low barriers, usually best on sloped barriers. So it's not a one method sort of fixes absolutely every river barrier in the system. But small barriers, which are the majority of them, there's The majority of our 1.2 million barriers in Europe, I think around 70% of those, don't quote me on that, but a good majority of them are weighs under 1.2 meters, or under 2 meters, sorry. So with that in mind, we could use, simple solutions to alleviate some of the pressures for eel at these specific barriers. And like I said, it's really cheap, it's really easy. All you're doing is creating a structure that an eel can climb through. Like I said before, this species is our only climbing fish. And what it does with these straw ropes is it uses them as that's the medium in which it climbs through. It's like its climbing frame. It goes through the center of these wetted straw ropes that are draped over the front of a sloped weir, and they climb under them. So they've got some refuge from predation. They climb through them, and if there's a big flood, if there's a big spate, they get washed out. They just degrade. They're straw and hay. And this is just a very, very basic example of how it doesn't always need to cost the earth to make these solutions and break the bank as well. This is a super simple method. It's used our largest wild eel fishery, I mentioned before, Loch Ness. They use this method, and they're a commercial fishery. And this is they do a trap and truck stocking program where they catch eels at the bottom and drive them up and release them. But then there's a good proportion of them which naturally get up through the River Bann, which connects Loch Ness to the sea. And the only thing allowing them into the entire loch is a couple of these straw ropes in a little concrete chute at the one side of some flood alleviation scheme. And it's incredible the amount of passage you can get through a couple of these straw ropes correctly installed. I can't stress that enough. And correctly, I guess, located on the right points in a weir or on a small sloped structure. These are a great method to allow eels up a river barrier. And next slide, please. So eDNA, very, very briefly touch on this. I was asked to mention this because there's potential that there could be some eDNA work for eel in the trust, and especially focusing on River Esk. And this method, eDNA, stands for environmental DNA, and essentially it works off the premise that all organic organisms, in this case fish, shed DNA into their environment. And they do this in varying amounts over varying times of the year, and it's dependent on a lot of different categories and criteria. But these organisms shed DNA through mucus, through breaking down of different cells as they grow and as they mature, but also through defecation. And this DNA can be picked up through a water sample. And this enables you to say if a animal is present or absent from an area. It's not quite there with abundance, because you could, for example, you could sample a vial of water next to an eel and pick up an enormous amount of DNA, whereas you could sample it on the other side of the river and pick up a very small amount of DNA. And you couldn't then say that the load of DNA in a single sample is equivalent to how many of that species is present in the area. But you get a wonderful insight into the fish community. If you are looking at fish alone, you can do this for mammals, you can do this for the invertebrates in the body of water that you're in, and you can look at different trophic levels within there. So it's really important, because you can look at different species that are present, different species which have not been found, but you thought maybe would be. It's great for picking up invasive species or potential problematic species. It's incredible for looking at the impact of river barriers, because you've got presence and absence below and above. And where you pick up, for example, say if you're looking for grayling in a river and you sampled below a weir and you sampled above, and there was no grayling above, you would be quite confident that in that immediate area that you sample below where they were present, the issue in that immediate area is the river barrier. And you can do this with really cool changes to some of the issues as well. If you have fish pass solutions or barrier removal, you can do before and you can do after, and you can look at the change in fish communities purely through the actions in which you're taking. And I think this is a really powerful tool, which is now coming to the forefront of ecology, how we understand the natural world, how we can gain easy information from it through advancements, significant advancements as well. And there's a lot of work which has gone into this, and it's getting better and better and better. And I'm very sure that one day we'll have great confidence in being able to pick up the abundance as well as just presence and absence, but we're not quite there yet. So on that, I think Ross is the next slide. Is that last one? Yes. You can play that, Ross. It is a video and it's pretty cool. If it will play, maybe. It's a little bit jerky for me, but yeah. Anyway, yeah, the eels are swimming around. It's very, very cute. But yeah, that's me. If anyone has any questions, or if anyone has any questions after this as well, email's just there. Or yeah, I'll hand over to the hosts now, and then yeah, ask away if you've got any questions.
Let me stop sharing. Oh, I should have cleared my throat before I started to speak. Thank you, Jack. Right, excellent. Yes, I will talk for a minute, Jack, let you get your voice back. Well done, and I'll let people think up questions if they don't already have them.
Hit the round of applause reacts.
Jack did touch on it a little bit, so just before we head into questions, I will mention that as part of Citizen S project, we are interested in doing some eDNA surveying for eels in the S catchment. We do not have a fully planned and mapped idea of how we want to deliver that, but the main goal would be to try and get some citizen science volunteers involved in coming out and helping us complete those surveys. So it would probably be a one-off, probably this autumn we'd be aiming for, going out to some targeted locations that probably Jack and some of my other colleagues would be informing me where would be best to get the most information and results. And then we'd be taking, yes, individuals or small groups of people out to help us collect that data. Now, this would obviously just be a first round, maybe, as depending on what we found and depending how people, whether people got involved with it and things, there could be more funding found in the future to continue to expand and explore using eDNA and find out really what's going on the ESCs. And just to give you a little bit of an idea, Jack's also mentioned, I think, electrofishing as a method that we would use to survey for fish, where we generally stun an area using an electric current. It causes the fish to be stunned, and then they kind of rise to the surface, so you can catch them when they're alive, and that way you can check a large area and identify almost all the fish in there, so you get a good idea of what species there are. We have done electrofishing on the ESC, but we only have about a dozen locations that we've ever electrofished in. So that might give you some idea of how much of that whole catchment, 320 square kilometers, has not been surveyed, or how little information we have in comparison to what we could gather in time. So I will go over to questions, and yeah, see, hopefully I should be able to click on folk and they should be able to unmute. So if I asked Alan, you have your hand up first. I was going to say, if you want to unmute yourself and go ahead with your question, that'd be great. Maybe a hand raised from earlier. And also see, Jackie, do you have a question? You can also write questions in the chat. We will get around to those as well if people would prefer. Just going to double check. I see something in my Q&A. I think Eli's been looking at those. Okay, so I see
chattering away in the Q&A, and we've got some in chat as well. In chat, Rachel and Henry, are there any areas / regions showing any signs of recovery?
Interesting, Jack. Any?
Yeah, so there are some interesting trends, and we look at usually We're looking at recruitment, so the eels coming in. So how many sort of young eels arrive at our coastline, and we use that as the indicator because that is obviously an indicator of how many spawners made it to the Sargasso as well. And in recent years, we've been seeing small little peaks in certain areas and some really, really good positive signs. But then in other areas, we've been seeing really low abundance of them as well. And this is just again with the eels and how they're sort of randomly distributed on currents. It can be really difficult to find these long-term trends, but there are data sets out there that are doing that. And the eels, I think personally, are we've sort of hit an all-time low on it. So the eels have got to a point where they're bouncing along at their very lowest level, but they're still relatively abundant. This species is, we still get huge recruitments. We're still talking about millions and millions of eels turning up in certain rivers across Europe. And this species is one of those ones that will hang on forever. They're really tenacious. They are survivors. So I think what we need to concentrate on doing is increasing the habitat across the range and generally increasing availability of habitat. And we'll start to see over a relatively long period of time that the numbers are starting to creep up because we're doing some really positive work. I don't think there's been enough positive work done yet, but each year we see such cool numbers coming back on how many barriers were removed across Europe, how many substantial barriers, how many small barriers right at the mouth of the river, which has been impeding movement for the past 100 years or so. So we're going to see this as a slow burner, and as there's definite hope for the eel because it is so hardy. Other species aren't as hardy and are having a harder time of it, but this species, I think it'll stick around, and we've just got to get this formula right. The work of people like the Forth Rivers Trust does such cool stuff that if we can get organizations working in this same manner across the board, then I really think that the eel has a really, really positive future, and we'll be laughing at pre-1980s once we get all these numbers back up again.
I think I'd like to add as well that I was down at the River Restoration Conference down in Wales a couple of weeks back, and one of the sort of main talking points, main issues was the conversation about trying to upscale what we as organisations across Europe are already doing, where we quite often do a small project, part of an estate on a section of river, and instead we should be starting to look at, well, what can we do in terms of the whole catchment of this river? And really, I think once those scale projects start going out, or rivers are being managed on catchment scale, on their issues at a catchment scale, we'll start seeing bigger and better solutions. At the moment, we're seeing really good best practice examples of what we could be doing if we scaled up. But the
Definitely.
first thing you always need to do is have that base ground data to know what you're doing is having an effect, or where best to implement those things. So data gathering is really important. Eli, seeing as you've been following these questions coming in, do you know which one came in next, and could you point us in the right direction, please?
We can start at the bottom, which was me just over an hour ago, or just under an hour ago. But Alan, you have your hand up. Do you have a question, or is it perhaps from earlier? I just don't want to, or we'll go straight to chat. But yes, 56 minutes ago, I said, Jack, if you had to pick, what's the coolest stage of the eel life cycle in your opinion?
I work at the moment with glass eels a lot, and I've just done 600 individual experiments on glass eels, and they all went back to the river as well, very safely, very happily. And yeah, that's a pretty cool life stage. They do this really, really nice thing, and all the life stages do it, but it's exceedingly cute when it's a glass eel, and when they're out of water, they puff up the cheeks. So they just gulp air in, stuff it into the cheeks, and it's just absolutely adorable. And because they're transparent, you can see the whole mechanism working. You can see the heart beating. You can see these big gill flaps puffed up, and the gills inside all red, filled with blood. You can see all of the organs running through them. You can see the vertebrae, and it's just absolutely it's just so cool to see. And because I keep them for quite a long time, well, not too long, like maybe 2-3 weeks at a time before each batch goes back, you see them going through these stages and pigmentation starting to gain slightly, and you start to see shapes on the heads where the pigmentation is coming in. And it's just, yeah, it's really astounding to see. It's so cool to watch them in this early life stage. And it's, you would get a fish, maybe like a salmon fry, like, very tiny little thing, like that year's hatch. And you'd be like, that is, that's days old. These eels, these glass eels, they're potentially 2 years old at that stage. These things are getting on. It's absolutely insane, and they're still tiny babies. And like I said, earlier, they're like a hair's width. They're tiny little things, and they are so tenacious. Yeah, you try and get measurements off them, and it's insane. It's so frustrating, but that is a great life stage. It's so cool. It really is.
I would agree. I think that's an amazing stage, and I agree with it mostly because of you touching on the stories that people associated with it in the past. Because people didn't understand where they came from, they just
Yeah.
looked around them and went, maybe it's that, maybe it's that. And some of them were really fanciful, but some of them make a lot of sense. The dew being there in the morning and potentially finding eels out on the grass. Or
Yeah.
I love one of my facts I was going to say at the start, and you didn't cover it, is that Aristotle thought that they sprang up from mud. And
Yeah.
if you think about glass eels maybe being really invisible and hard to see on the beach, and then a few weeks later you're going to start seeing all these muddy coloured eels
Mm,
swimming up the rivers from your estuaries, you go, well, that actually makes perfect sense to think they maybe just came from deeper down in that mud.
yeah.
Why imagine that they came from 4,000 miles away across the Atlantic Ocean? It's quite amazing,
Exactly.
but an incredible stage. Yeah.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, I agree.
Definitely.
It's fascinating. And just being able to see everything as well. Very cool. I had also asked, I said, I'd love to know if we know the average or maximum distance that an eel can travel over land, because I find it really cool that, they're the only fish species that can do that. So,
So yeah, in terms of how far they can travel, I don't really know. There's mad, really, really mad things that people find, where there's no connection to a body of water and it's 40 miles in and an eel's in there, and everyone's like, oh, I don't know if actually it could have done that. That doesn't seem likely. And probably just someone's whacked it in a bag and chucked it in there one day. But there's absolute mad stuff like that, and no one really knows. But we do know it. So a fish rescue that we did at the trust when the canal breached, and I think maybe day 4 afterwards, when we had done this huge fish rescue, a monumental effort, and we had all nearly killed ourselves trying to just desperately get every single fish out and rescue everything. And we went back on day 4, and obviously everything had dried up, all the water had gone in these areas that had flooded. And we were going down just to really get an idea of if any fish were left in any big puddles or anything like that. And there was loads of eels just sat on the mud, and all of them with the cheeks puffed up, all sat there, and they weren't going anywhere, and they were just waiting. And this was, they'd been out of water for at least 24 hours, and they were just on damp-ish mud. They just sat there, and they do this incredible thing where they go into like almost a dormant stage where they're just preserving everything, and they're just in like a keep alive mode. And you pick them up, and they're just limp, nothing. But and I mean the second they touch water with any part of their body, they just lose it, and they flip and just wriggle as hard as they can to get back into that water and shoot off. And we had an absolute nightmare of it because we took buckets of water with us, and the worst thing you can do at that stage was put an eel in it, because it just rocketed out again. And there's eels all over the place, and it was a real nightmare. So in the end, we were carrying them dry back, releasing them there and then, because it was just unbelievable. It was so much hard work. But yeah, so these things, even in the worst of scenarios, dry out of water and with no chance of getting back to it, they'll still hold on, and they'll still, they're a really, really hardy species. So in terms of how far they can travel, I'm sure there's some impressive distances which
some
have been covered.
distance.
But there's also some really fanciful stories that'd be like, yeah, got to the top of Everest and now down the back again. But So I think everything needs to be taken with a pinch of salt when it comes to some of these things. But yeah, I reckon they could do a good stint.
We had John Kerry, who he said, I've seen some Victorian and 18th century headstones in memory of eel catchers in West Lothian. Some have carvings of lamprey as well as eels. Did lamprey suffer a population decline as serious as eels?
Very, very cool. I'd love to know the locations of those. That sounds like a great day out for me. I'd love to see those. Yeah, it's very, very cool. And be interesting also to track down some of that, you know, where these people were fishing, some of that history behind it. So very cool. So yeah, definitely drop the trust an email. We're keen to chase that up. But in terms of lamprey are doing particularly bad in certain areas. You've got the river lamprey, the brook lamprey, and the sea lamprey, the species that we have. Sea lamprey, as it says, go to sea. River lamprey also have this stage. Brook lamprey don't, and the population declines are so hard to map in lamprey because they have this life stage, like with some of the species going to sea, but then also the fact that they're young is they have this ammosetes stage where the younger stages are submerged in silt, usually very, very fine silt and very, very fine sand. And they live in this stage for a while and then emerge as like usually called a transformer, where that would be your typically looking lamprey with eyes, fully functioning eyes, and looks like a proper lamprey. Ammosetes look like just some crazy thing from hell. It's insane. They're really, really odd looking things, like a worm with an attachment to it. They're odd little things. But because of this, it's actually really hard to get a real understanding of lamprey. Sometimes there's fishing records, which would, again, this is an interesting thing to touch on. People did fish for lamprey. I don't believe it was ever as prolific as eel fishing, but lamprey were caught, were eaten, and I guess just these weird oddities within their life stages make it incredibly hard to map populations. I know within the trust, we do lamprey specific surveys where you scan over silt beds with electrofishing gear, and even then, you know, you get an estimate of what's there, but still, because they're sensitive species and because we do it only for set periods of time, you only get a catch ratio or a catch efficiency of a certain amount. So they're incredibly hard to manage. We do know that they have suffered to a large extent, though, and habitat fragmentation is incredibly damaging to them because of their method of swimming and their swimming abilities. It's usually quite low in terms of their ability to swim at high velocities, but they have this amazing ability to latch onto rocks, rest, and then go up and burst speed. But if there's nothing to latch onto, or if the velocities are just too high, and it's, you know, a fish ladder that's been built for salmon, you know, that usually won't work for a lamprey. So they are in trouble. All species of the lamprey have seen significant decline. We do know that, but we just don't really know to what extent. But yeah, a very, very, very cool species, and I had the pleasure of seeing some really amazing ones and spawning ones in some of the rivers around the fourth catchment, which is, yeah, quite a cool thing to see.
Great. If there's a moment to ask a question, I've wondered for a while. Now that we can start testing the DNA, are we starting to see that sort of family return, the hereditary trait, you know, that DNA of the same family coming back to the same rivers? Because obviously a lot of people will talk about salmonids and they know, oh, a salmon will return to the river it was spawned in. But do we see eels growing up in one river, spawning out at sea, and their offspring trying to come back to the same river?
So it's a question that always does come up, and it is tied to the salmon and the understanding behind salmon. In the shortest answer, no, and not in any way, because of the interesting way in which an eel would spawn. So you could have an Italian father and a Northern African mother, and your offspring would end up in the north of Scotland. And it's just random. It's panmictic spawning, which is a massive release of eggs and milk into an area. All the big soup gets mixed together, and then those fertilized eggs drift and they'll break up and separate into groups and bands in this big soup. and they'll just be somewhat randomly distributed. The only thing that wouldn't be random is that we think there's like batch spawning potentially. So eels that get there sooner may spawn in an area, and then there may be like satellite populations of other eels spawn in different locations or at different times, slightly different times. So that's really the only thing that would have staggered effects of releases of eel coming back at different times. But it is incredible, really, the timing and the ability and the cohesion of this spawning event. We're not talking about, they're just spawning all year endlessly because eels are just staggering and there continuously. It's incredible. They migrate en masse, and there's even documented areas where eels will wait to be in congregations and move together as one mass. And to believe like a really important area is the Azores, and that's like a landmark area where eels will gather before moving off into the Sargasso Sea. And so again, we still don't know half of what we need to know to truly understand this spawning process. But this much like this really randomized mix up of stuff, and then distribution across different ocean currents really just makes it really genetically diverse. And there is no genetically distinct populations that have established that we've ever found. So yeah, an eel is an eel.
Thank you. Just another quick thing is, do we see similar declines in other species of eels in other parts of the world? Or is this a European eel crisis?
So yeah, really interesting actually. All freshwater eels are in decline, every single species. And I always get this number wrong, but I think it's 16 species. I know I'll look back in all my notes and books and stuff and it'll be wrong, but around about that, because we have a couple of subspecies which sometimes get reclassified, sometimes are distinct species, and all these arguments kick off within the eel community. But yeah, of all the species of freshwater eel we know, all are in decline in various degrees. And the main ones in severe trouble are your temperate species, or your Anguilla rostrata, the American eel, the European eel, Anguilla, Anguilla japonica, the Japanese eel, and yeah, they're usually like the big three that are heavily exploited and have some real issues. Rostrata, so the American eel, now is going through some real turmoil, and the trade of American eel was stimulated by the fact that the European eel trade was banned. You couldn't trade outside of Europe. So the Asian trade, which came in, which has a huge demand for freshwater eel, then moved to America for legal trade, so they could still legally purchase and buy eels to eat. And that's just meant that there's been a huge demand increase, and also a lot of the issues which are happening now, where you've got the Native American indigenous people who control a lot of the fisheries for eel. They are deciding to not sell eel, or they're feeling that the numbers are being exploited too heavily, and it's just moving to a legal trade, so they're poaching them instead. And this trade is really difficult and very sensitive in a lot of areas. And yeah, we are seeing a shift to more darker sides of trade across areas which are trying to regulate the trade a little bit more heavily. So it's a really tricky situation, and not one that you'd expect to find in eel or in the fish world, where it's going to really deep, dark, horrible black markets, and there's a lot of sort of corruption in there. So it's a difficult one. Yeah, not an easy thing to solve at all.
But also, I think quite useful to know that if we start finding solutions here to some of those problems, they'll probably be adaptable and useful in all those other places as well.
Sure, definitely, yeah.
Thank you. Okay, well, we're just past our time. I don't know if there's any last questions. If there are, what I will say to everyone is that Eli will be putting out an email to everyone that's joined us tonight, giving a wee kind of roundup, but also just giving some useful contact details and things if you have any further questions. But also, if you'd like to join us to look at doing volunteering with the Trust, we are doing invasive species plant surveying this summer. We're doing outfall safari surveying on the Esks to look for discharging outfalls and get them mapped. And hopefully later come autumn, we'll be doing some eel surveying. If you'd like to join us, we'll be sending you the details to register as a volunteer with us as well. But once again, thank you for joining us. Jack, a huge thank you. As always, it's really interesting listening to what you've got to say. And even though I've heard you give the presentation before, I was still going, oh, wow. And do find myself just going, yeah, I'm won over. Eels are quite amazing.
Great. Good to see you all anyway. And yeah, thanks for letting me talk about eels.
Thank you so much for giving that talk, Jack. Do check the chat for the location of those graves. I'm not reading it out for fear of mispronouncing and embarrassing myself on record.
Ravenside and Torfichan.
That one. I'm going to hit stop recording as well.